Alright, hi everyone. Let's continue with our data structures and algorithm series. In our previous video, we discussed about recursion and how to use it to solve our problems. In our today's video, we are going to discuss about a design pattern that is commonly used with recursion, and that pattern is helper method recursion. This pattern is very helpful when we need to persist our data. For example, when you are given some input data, you want to store it after modification and return it after completing your process. Not like the one which we have seen in our previous video, which was something like this factorial, right? In this factorial method, what we were doing is taking single input and then returning single output. But what if I ask you to return an array that has all of the numbers included in finding this factorial? For example, n is 4, then the factorial will look something like 4 multiply 3 multiply 2 multiply 1. And I ask you to return all these numbers in an array. In that case, you might end up trying this solution, where you are defining a variable called array and initializing it with an empty array, and with every recursive call, you might be pushing the number into this array. You might think it will give me the output in this format with all the numbers, but that's not true, because with every recursive call, this array is going to be reinitialized with empty array every time, which means in the end you will only have single number, which will be your last input, that is 1. So now to solve these kind of problems where you need to persist the data, we can use helper method recursion. Now let's see how exactly this design pattern looks. So your helper method recursion pattern will something look like this. All we need to do is define an outer function. Like in this code you can see I have a main function that contains two things. One is variable or state where data will be persisted or stored, like in this code my array variable. And then we have to define our helper function that will be called recursively. As in this code you can see I have a helper function that takes an input and called itself recursively with a different input every time, and then we trigger this recursion. Once all the process is done, we will return our modified array. So that's how you can solve the problem of persisting data in recursion using helper method recursion pattern. Now let's jump onto the code sandbox and try to solve a real question. Alright, so I already have the problem statement written here. Find all the odd values from given array nums. For example, if nums is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then output will be 1, 3 and 5. If it is 7, 8, 9, 13, then the output will be 7, 9, 13. And if there is no odd values in the given array, then return the empty array. Now let's try to solve it with our helper method recursion pattern. Now if you remember, our first step is to define an outer function. My outer function is already here. I will just rename the input as nums. Now my next step is to define a variable that will store the data, and our next step is define the helper function that will be called recursively. It will accept an input. We will write our logic here. Now we need to call this helper function. We will pass our input, that is nums, and in the end we will return our array, right? So that's how our helper method recursion pattern looks, as we have already seen it in our slides. Now let's try to write the logic. For recursion, our first thing is to define the base case. Input.length equals to 0, then return. This will be our base case. And next condition will be if input 0th index modulo 2 not equal to 0, then update our array variable and push the 0th index value to the array. Now it's time to call our helper function recursively. And remember, the input value should be different every time. For that, we are going to remove the first index value every time from our input array, so that this condition checks every time the next element. It will look something like, if input is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in our next recursive call, it will look something like 2, 3, 4, 5. In next call, it will look 3, 4, and 5, and so on. Once this process is done, we can return our array, and that's all we need to do in our helper method recursion pattern. Now let's try to run this function and see the output in our console. For that, let's open the preview tab, open the console. Let's uncomment this one. For now, I will use our example number 1. Alright, so we are getting the expected output. Now let's try to see this example. Cool, we are getting the expected output here as well. Alright, that's all for this video. In our upcoming videos, we are going to learn some of the popular searching algorithms. So stay tuned for that. And thanks for watching.